Welcome to an installment of CCSD Living Environment. Today we're going to talk about the maintenance and formation of ecosystems. Now remember, an ecosystem is the living and non-living components and how they interact together in their environment. But before we can move too far into ecosystems, we first need to talk about the biosphere. You talked in earth science about the atmosphere, and you talked about the lithosphere being the plates, and the hydrosphere being the water. The biosphere is the portion of the earth where living things live, or where living things exist. Keep in mind there are many complex ecosystems within the biosphere. So the biosphere is the whole group, and then the ecosystems are kind of all throughout that biosphere. So to maintain an ecosystem, to maintain that stability in an ecosystem, there's three factors that we have to have. The first one being a constant input of energy from the sun. If we talk a little bit about physics, a little bit about the first law of thermodynamics, it tells us that energy can't be created or destroyed, it just changes form. Well, if energy can't be created, then we have to have it come in from somewhere. And our source of energy is the sun. So if we have all this energy coming in, that's great, but we have to have a way to use the energy. And so we need to have the producers, which remember are green plants and algae, we need to have the producers that take the energy from the sun and convert it into something that we can use. So our producers are going to take that energy and convert it for us. So now we've put the energy into the system, we have something to use that energy so the rest of us can use it, and then what do we do with all of it when we're done? Well, we have to put it back to the system, and that's where our decomposers come into play. The decomposers take whatever's left, plants or animals, after they die, or the waste products of those plants or animals, and they take the nutrients or whatever else they can get to cycle back into the system, and they put it back into that system of the earth, back into the ecosystem. Maintaining the ecosystem is great, but we have to form them before we can maintain them. The formation of ecosystems, we use something called ecological succession. Now in succession, it's a change in the community resulting in new populations of organisms, gradually replacing existing ones until a stable stage or climax community is reached. In that definition, there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of words we've already talked about. So let's go back and look. A community, remember, is all of the populations in one area, all of the species in one area. So the population is a species in a location. That's the definition. So what we're saying is that we're going to replace one species with another inside a community until we reach a stable point, until we reach what we would call the climax. It's as far as you're going to go. Now, if we talk about our area here, obviously for us that's going to be a forest. So that's basically telling you that every piece of land that's out there is trying to get to that climax community. Now, do they all reach it? No, they don't, but they're trying. And again, it's not something we can see, but just know that it's this idea that we want to get to that stable stage. We want to reach the climax community. That's a point where things are kind of in harmony with each other, and that's where we want to get to. The climax community is a stable ecosystem where the populations have reached a dynamic equilibrium. Therefore, they exist in a balance with each other and the environment. So we need to go back to that word dynamic equilibrium. We have to go back to that term. Remember, if we talk about equilibrium, equilibrium is a balance. If things are in balance, everything's equal. There's not really any change. I've got 5 grams on this side, 5 grams on this side. But with dynamic equilibrium, what's happening is you may have a little bit of an increase, a little bit of a decrease, but overall we're maintaining that balance. Overall, things are equal. Now that doesn't mean all the time, because there's some influx or some decrease. There's something changing in the population. But overall, if you look at the average or if you look at the vast majority, there's a balance within the population. So with the climax community, the populations are in that balance. That balance will be maintained until some catastrophe or a major biotic or abiotic factor is altered in that ecosystem, it will maintain that balance. It will hold that balance basically forever. Because once you've reached the point where things are in harmony, things are in balance, things are in check, if you will, why would you want to leave that state? So once the ecosystem has gotten to that climax community, it wants to stay there. It wants to maintain that. So unless some major thing comes along, could be biotic or abiotic, unless something comes along, it's going to keep that balance steady. It's not going to change. When we talk about these climax communities, we need to look at the producers for a minute. Remember, your producers are the green plants and algae. So if we talk about the producers in the climax community, there's a couple things that we need to keep in mind. And the first thing that we need to think about is the fact that the producers are going to dominate in the sense that they're the most abundant food source. We never think about that. Because if you go out and you look in an ecosystem and you see all these chipmunks running around or all these mice running around, you think there's a lot of food there for the fox and the wolf or whatever happens to be the next step up. But we never take into account the producers. If you have a lot of fox, then you know you have a lot of chipmunks or mice. If you've got a lot of chipmunks and mice, we never think back to the producers that are there. Everything is dependent on those producers. They're the ones that determine how much food is going to be there for everybody. Because it's those mice and chipmunks that are eating the producers. Then you can have your bigger predators come into play. The other thing to keep in mind is that the producers are the major limiting factor for animal succession. What do we mean by that? Well, yeah, it's a food source, but there's more to it than that. In some cases, it could be where the animal lives. In some cases, it could be what else do they need the plants for? Like, for example, there's some species of birds that require different plants for reproduction. Whether it's because they can only build their nest in one tree or they need a specific type of leaf, whatever it happens to be. But the producers really limit the animals that can live in an area. Now, the animals that live here, where we are, aren't the same animals that live, say, in the grasslands of the Midwest. And the animals that live in the grasslands of the Midwest aren't the same animals that live here. Why is that? Well, it's because the producers, the green plants, are different. And those green plants really play a big role in what happens to the rest of that ecosystem. And we leave the plants out more often than not because we just don't think about them. We kind of take them for granted, and we shouldn't, because they play a huge role in the ecosystem. So at this point, we've talked about where on Earth things live, and we've talked about how to maintain that ecosystem. So now what we need to look at is a little bit more of the types to succession. How do we form that ecosystem? There's two different ways we can do it. The first one is called primary succession. With primary succession, the ecosystem is completely destroyed, and we need to start over from scratch. Now, what do I mean from scratch? If you've done any baking at home and you start something from scratch, you know that you're not using a box mix for like brownies or cake. You're starting from nothing. You're starting with flour and sugar, maybe oil, and you're building something from there. Well, if primary succession takes place, the ecosystem is left with nothing. Something came along, maybe it was a volcanic eruption, and it got rid of everything. There's no plants left. There's no soil left. That nice, rich, organic soil for things to start life is gone. What we're left with is bare rock. We're wiped out. The only thing left is a surface of rock. How can we possibly rebuild an ecosystem from rock? Well, lichen in that case are the first things to show up. And lichen are something that's kind of a cool little thing going on as far as an organism is concerned. It's not just one organism, it's two. There's an algae and there's a fungus. The algae can undergo photosynthesis, and the fungus maybe provides a little protection for the algae, because algae are usually in water, and maybe a little moisture for the algae. And so the algae is undergoing photosynthesis, making food. The fungus can get nutrients from the algae, and the algae can kind of hang out with the fungus. Well, where do we find lichen? Chances are you've seen lichen many times, but you didn't know what it was. If you look on a rock or you look on the side of a tree maybe, and you find that gray kind of crunchy flaky stuff, that's lichen. It's not what we would think of as a plant, because it's not, and it's really not just simply a fungus like a mushroom growing on a dead tree. So you kind of have both of those things living together. It's kind of a cool little setup. Now, as to whether one is benefited or not, I think the jury's still kind of out on that. But for the two of them, the algae and the fungus, they've got a nice thing going. And because of them, they can take and modify that environment on the bare rock. And they can turn it into something where, well, they've done enough modification that they can't hang out there anymore. But they make it so mosses can. And the mosses move into the area. And once the mosses have moved in, the mosses modify the environment. And as the mosses modify the environment, they change it enough that they can't really live there anymore. So then the grasses move in. And the grasses hang out in the environment, and they modify the environment. And they make it so they can't live there anymore, so the evergreens or softwoods move in. And I think you're starting to see the pattern here. They modify the environment enough so they can't live there anymore, but they make it so the environment is where the deciduous trees can move in. Now, if we go back to the definition of a climax community, what's happening? We're replacing one population with another until a stable stage or climax community is reached. Deciduous trees really are, in New York State, our climax community. What are the deciduous trees? Those are our hardwoods. That's the maple and oak. This is where we want to get to. This is the ultimate ecosystem, if you will, for where we live. Now, in other parts of the world, it could be evergreens. If we move north into Canada, you see this is your climax community. If we move to the Midwest, you're going to see grasses as your climax community. So depending on where you are, the climax community changes in the biosphere. But the idea is that we're replacing one population with another until we reach that stable stage. Now, if you're asking yourself, what is a deciduous tree? That's a really good question. I've told you it's maple and oak. I've given you the example, but what does it mean? A deciduous tree is a tree that loses its leaves in the wintertime. The leaves fall off, as opposed to an evergreen tree, which is forever green. So the idea is that these guys hang on to their leaves, which are the needles. These guys don't. These guys drop them. Now, why would that be true? And why are you telling me that a needle is a leaf? Well, if you're outside, or maybe at Christmas time, if you get a Christmas tree, you can take an evergreen tree and you can take one of the needles off. And if you look and you're very careful about it, you can unroll that needle. And what you'll find is that it's a leaf. It's a leaf that's rolled up very, very tightly. Now, with a deciduous tree, you know what a maple leaf or an oak leaf looks like. It's this great big leaf, this great big surface area. Why would I want to lose those? Because it's a huge water loss for the plant. We don't want that in the wintertime. It's too cold. Not as much water loss with the evergreen, so they can hang on to them. It doesn't hurt them. So with primary succession, let's go back and review. I'm starting with nothing. I'm back to bare rock. There's nothing there. And each one of these populations comes through and modifies or changes the environment enough so that the next thing in line can live there. But along the way, they can't. That's why in our deciduous forest, we don't see a lot of other things. Now, granted, once you have that tree canopy, the stuff underneath can't grow, but that would make sense. Each time, those populations go away, and that's why we end up with what we end up with. So what's the other type? The other type of succession is secondary succession. An ecosystem is damaged, mainly leaving some organisms in soil to rebuild. So we haven't completely wiped it out. We're not totally back to rock. Maybe there's some soil. Maybe we have some rich information there, some rich stuff that things can kind of root into and get going. So instead of starting back with the bare rock, we may actually start with grasses. Now, if you have something go through, it could be a bulldozer, it could be a bad snowstorm, it could be maybe a rainstorm, a flood. It doesn't completely wipe everything away in every situation. Usually you're left with something. So we can start partway through and move our way through the rest of the succession process. But the thing for you to keep in mind is that once we get here, that's as far as we're going to go, regardless of what type of succession it is. With secondary succession starts because there's some disruption to the climax community. And I think you can see that to write that down. You have some disruption to your climax community. It could be from a flood, hurricane, tornado, snowstorm, whatever it is that kind of destroyed the climax community. So if you're not completely back to scratch, is it going to take as long for secondary succession as it takes for primary succession? No, probably not. But succession takes time. We don't get back to those big maple and oak trees overnight. Sometimes it can take hundreds of years, but the process is restarted, and we're rebuilding our way back to that climax community. One final thing to talk about when it comes to your climax community, and that's what actually determines the climax community of an ecosystem. The climate is what determines the climax community of an ecosystem. When we talk about climate, remember, we're not talking about weather. Weather is what's happening here today, right now. Climate, we're talking about what's the overall picture for an area. So generally, we're concerned with the temperature and the precipitation. So when we're looking at the climate, we want to know what is the temperature and what is the precipitation in that area. And that's going to determine your climax community. We've spent a lot of time talking about the climax community in New York State. And we mentioned the climax community in the grasslands. Well, why are they different? The primary difference between them is the precipitation. It's really not the temperature. Temperatures are very similar. But there's not enough water for the trees that we have here to grow in the grasslands. So because of that, you get a certain group of animals, like burrowing animals, prairie dogs maybe, that grow in the grasslands. We don't see them here. It's kind of tough to burrow through the ground if you've got tree roots in your way. And big animals like deer and wolves, coyotes, things like that. Not that we have a lot of wolves here, but those big animals that require more of your tree and wooded areas, you don't see them as much there. Not to say that you don't have any predators, because there are, but there's different animals. And again, it goes back to the fact that the producers are really what's dictating what animals can live in an area. So our takeaway message is that the climate can determine the climax community of the ecosystem. And that's an important thing for you to keep in mind.